In the summer of 1953, 3 weeks after we buried my husband, I paid $7 at the Val estate sale for a wagon load of clay jugs, every one of them cracked through the shoulder. The men with cash and creek bottom took the tractor, the pump jack, the good galvanized pipe, and they did not bother to hide their smiles. Everyone in that yard agreed I had bought $7 of trash and would have to haul it off myself. It took me 2 summers to understand what Emil Val had actually left in that shed, and what I did with those cracked jugs instead. It was an August sale, the kind where the dust hangs at knee-height all afternoon, and the auctioneer keeps a wet rag folded under his hat. Emil Val had died in June, 81 years old, a potter and a bachelor, and his place out on the Dry Fork Road went to pieces in 4 hours the way places do. Cream separator, $11. Grindstone, $3. When they got to the hay rack stacked with jugs, the auctioneer tipped one so we could all see daylight through the crack, and he said he'd take any offer at all. Nobody spoke. I raised 2 fingers because I had come in a borrowed wagon and hated to go home empty, and a man behind me laughed the way you laugh at a child bidding on a hat. Understand my situation. I was 34, with 40 acres of sandhill ground north of town that Warren and I had been sweetening for 6 years, a melon patch, a shallow well that went milky by July, and $400 in a coffee tin. Sand ground drinks. You water in the morning, and by 4 o'clock the topsoil has gone pale as ash, and the vines lie down like they have decided something. There were 311 jugs on that rack. I counted them off the wagon by lantern light, and every single one had its hairline split, and every single one had been packed upright in straw and sorted by size, largest to smallest, the way a careful man arranges things he intends to use. That is the part that kept me awake. A potter throws a bad jug and breaks it for road fill. Emil Val had saved 40 years of his failures, and along his own bean rows, buried to the neck with flat stones laid over their mouths, stood 12 more. The first year, the rain came when it was asked. The second summer, it never came at all. That second summer came on politely, the way the bad ones always do. We had half an inch on the 9th of May, a good soaking that brought the beans up even and made everybody generous at church, and then the sky went the color of skim milk and stayed that way. 11 hundredths on the 4th of July, enough to spot the hood of the truck. Nothing else worth the walk out to the gauge until the 22nd of August. By the middle of June, the road dust hung over the section line for a quarter hour after a car went by, and you could hear the corn across the fence at Pribbenau's making a sound like paper being handled in another room. I started with 1 jug, number 61. By the numbers, Emil Val had scratched into the shoulder of each one with a nail before he fired it, and the crack in that one ran from the lip down into the belly like a hair caught under glass. I set it in the kitchen garden between 2 hills of pickling cucumbers, buried to within 2 fingers of its mouth, tamped the dirt against it with the butt of the shovel handle, and filled it with the watering can, 2 gallons and a cup. Then I laid a flat stone over the mouth, the way Emil had, and cut a willow stick to the water line and stood it in the jug like a dipstick. 4 days. That is what it took, in June heat, for 2 gallons to leave that jug, and not a spoonful of it went up into the air. I know because on the 4th evening I dug down beside it with my hands, and the dirt came up dark and cool and smelled like a cellar, a wet bulb the size of a wash basin, threaded through with white cucumber roots that had found the clay and laid themselves against it the way a cat lays against a stove. Above ground, the leaves were flat and green at 4 in the afternoon, while everything else in the county was folded up like a closed umbrella. That was the whole of it. Right there in a hole the depth of my forearm, and I sat back on my heels in the dust and laughed out loud, alone, like a woman who has been told a joke a year too late. You have to understand what the ground was by then. The spud bar rang off it. I had to pour a coffee can of water in each spot and go do something else for an hour before I could open a hole, and I opened 143 of them between the 11th of June and the 2nd of July. Pole beans, 8 rows, 1 jug to every 4 hills, which is what Emil's own hand told me to do. Melons, 1 jug to 2 hills. Tomatoes, 1 to 1. And there was a line in his book about that I will come to. My knees went the color of the clay and stayed that color into September. My palms cracked at the base of every finger from the lime dust, and I taped them with adhesive from the barn kit and kept on. Filling was the work that never ended. A 55-gallon drum on a stone sled behind the Alice, a length of gutter downspout laid in the drum's bung to run the water where I wanted it, and me walking the rows at dusk with a cream can and a funnel, lifting a stone, filling, setting the stone back. 286 gallons to fill them all, twice a week. A jug taking water makes a sound like a man drinking who has not spoken in a while. The downspout was Wendell Auck's idea, though he never called it an idea. He was 81 and drove a wagon because he preferred it, and one morning in the last week of June, I came out to the gate and found a stack of Flat Creek shale there, 40 or 50 slabs, sized like dinner plates, and no note. 2 days later, he came by and stood at the end of the bean rows with his hands behind him and looked a long while at those clay mouths going away from him in a line, each one capped with his stone. Emil used a downspout, he said. Then he asked after my aunt's hip, and he left. Down at Ostrander's elevator, they had a better time with it than Wendell did. Dale Pribenow had put in a new well that spring, 410 feet, and a sprinkler rig that threw water in a white arc you could see from the highway, and a man with a rig like that has a certain amount of pity to spend. He called my jugs tombstones. He said it kindly, the way you'd say it about a woman's hat. Marvin Tolliver said if I set out a saucer, maybe the rain would come down and drink from it. Somebody said crockery was the one crop the crows wouldn't touch. I stood there with my sack of nails and let them have it, because they were not wrong about how it looked. 143 cracked jugs, bought at the Val estate sale for $7 because nobody else in 3 townships would give the auctioneer a bid for a hayrack of broken pottery, set in the ground with rocks on their heads. It looked like a woman burying her savings. The ledger I found on the last day of June, out at Emil's place, in the tack room, under a coffee tin of washers on a shelf I had walked past 4 times. A grocery account book, the kind with the red cloth spine, and every page of it in pencil in a small square hand. Dates, jug numbers, gallons, the word. Dry, with a date beside it, whole years of it, 1931, 1934, and 1936, and every dry stretch after, weather written down not as complaint, but as arithmetic. Bean, 1 jug to 4 hills. Melon, 1 to 2. Tomato wants 1 to 1, and does not thank you. And near the bottom of one page, in the same flat hand, the sound tells you, a whole jug rings, a good one hushes. That is what a lifetime of failures at the wheel had given him. Every jug too flawed to sell was a jug that would weep. The last written page stopped my hand where it was. A tally. Made 412, buried 388. And below it, dated the October before he died, 3 words I have thought about every dry summer since. The deep ones, Huerti, West 80, marked. I had 143, my cistern held 1,100 gallons and was down to 400, the windmill wanted wind, and there had been none for 9 days, and somewhere Emil Val had put 40 jugs of a kind he called deep, in a field I could not find on any map that had his name still on it. I read those 3 words by lamplight, until the oil in the lamp went low, and the letters started to swim, and then I set the notebook on the table with the flat rock on top of it, the way Emil Val had left it, and went out to look at a sky that had nothing in it. That was the 10th morning. The windmill's tail hung slack as a dish towel. I had made a habit of checking the rain gauge on the garden post even though I knew what was in it. And what was in it was a dead moth and a 1/4 inch of dust that had come in on a hot wind 3 weeks before and had never washed out. 11 months on that gauge had given me 4 1/2 inches. The corn I had put in on the low ground had rolled its leaves into tight green cigars by 9 in the morning and did not open them again until dark, and where the field met the fence, the stalks had gone the color of a paper sack. I measured the cistern with a piece of lath and a nail hole, the way my father had taught me, and I kept the marks in chalk on the block wall by the pump so I would not lie to myself about it. 400 gallons on the 10th, 340 on the 13th. The house and the stock took 55 gallons a day if I was careful, and I was careful. A basin of wash water carried out to the hollyhocks, the hen's pan filled at dusk instead of noon, so less of it went up into the air. The cow watered twice and not 3 times. 55 gallons a day out of 340 is 6 days, and 6 days is not a season. The well itself was the harder truth, 38 feet down to a sand point my grandfather had driven, and it had been honest water for 40 years, but that summer when the wind did come up at daybreak and the rod started its slow chuckle, what came out of the pipe was warm and had grit in it, and after 4 or 5 minutes it came in coughs. Merle Sanderson brought his rig by on his way to a job north of the river and stood at the wellhead with his hat pushed back and listened the way a doctor listens. Second sands at 180, 190, he said. $4.60 the foot. Casings on top of that. $900, near enough. I had a note at the bank for $214 coming due the 15th of September on the pump and the 2-bottom plow, and I had a paper signed in March with the cannery buyer out of Dodgeville for 4 acres of tomatoes, 12 tons promised at $22 the ton. $264 was what those 4 acres were worth to me if they came in, and that money was the whole winter, the coal, the note, the seed for the next spring. Short the contract and the buyer kept the crate. Short the contract and the buyer kept the crate. Deposit, $22 I had signed away in March against baskets and hauling, and he would be within his rights to keep it, and within his rights besides to strike my name off his book for the following year. That was the arithmetic I carried out of Otis Renk's yard that afternoon, past his drilling rig with its cable and its mud-caked bit, and it did not improve any on the drive home, so I did what a person does who owns a pump and no well. I hauled. The creek that runs the south edge of my place had been a creek in April, and by the second week of July, it was a string of pools, some of them no bigger than a wash tub, joined underneath by wet gravel you could hear if you stood still. The deepest hole was under the sycamore at the bend, chest deep in a good year, thigh deep that summer, with the water the color of weak coffee and a skin of dust on it every afternoon by 4. I skidded the pump down there on a stone boat and set it level on 2 railroad ties, and I wrapped the suction screen in a feed sack because otherwise it drew silt and the silt would score the impeller, and Renk had already told me what a new impeller cost. I had 4 50-gallon drums that came off the Wenzel sale for $1.50 apiece. 2 of them leaked at the bottom seam, so I turned them and soaped the seams and drove the leaks up where the water level wouldn't sit long, and I built a cradle out of 2x6s on the wagon to keep them from walking. Dolly, the mule, was 15 that summer and had opinions about hills, but she pulled a good steady line, and she would stand at the end of a tomato row all day without being tied. The routine went like this. Start the engine, prime the pump, fill 4 drums in a shade over 6 minutes. Lead Dolly up the lane to the field, which is a 1/4 mile and rises maybe 11 feet. Dip and pour, plant by plant, out of a 2-gallon galvanized bucket with a dented lip, 1 gallon to a hill, and walk the row and do it again. 200 gallons went in the ground in about 25 minutes if I did not stop, and I did stop, because a person's hands cramp closed around a bucket bale in that kind of heat, and you have to open them with your other hand. 9 trips was a full day. 9 trips was 1,800 gallons. I had 14,000 hills in those 4 acres. I did that arithmetic on the back of the cannery contract, sitting on the wagon tongue at noon with my hat off, and it came out to 8 days to go around the field one time, in a stretch of weather, where the plants wanted water twice a week, and would have taken it 3. There is a particular quiet that arrives when you understand that the work you are doing cannot be done. It is not despair exactly. It is more like the sound a saw makes when it hits a nail, so I cut the field down. That is what everybody does, and there is no shame in it, and it still felt like choosing which children to feed. I let the 2 north acres go, the low ones, the ones I had set out first and staked best, and I hauled to the 2 on the west. A week later I cut it again, to 1,100 hills on the sandy rise where the fruit had set heaviest, and I walked away from the rest and did not look at them, because the leaves on an abandoned tomato had gone gray-green and curled up along the midrib like a hand closing, and after a while they rattled. The heat kept on. We had 1/10 of an inch on the 22nd of June, and nothing after that anybody would call rain. The wind came out of the southwest every afternoon at 15-16 miles an hour, dry as a stove, and the little yellow blossoms opened and dried and dropped off in the dust, and where a blossom drops there is no tomato. You can water all you please, and it will not put back a blossom that has already let go. What I did put on came up wrong. I would find them in the picking, good big fruit, 5 and 6 ounces, and I would turn one over in my hand, and there on the bottom was a flat, black, leathery patch the size of a nickel, sunk in, dry as a scab. Blossom and Drought. It comes from feast and famine, from a plant getting a gulp and then 8 days of nothing, and it does not wash off and it does not ripen out, and no grader at any cannery door will let it past. In the 3rd week, I picked 41 bushels and culled 19 of them into the hog lot. Alvin Teal came by on his way to the mailbox and stood out of a nickel, sunk in, dry as a scab. I had another bushel on my hip going to the hogs when he spoke, and he was standing at the end of the row with his hands in his hip pockets and his straw hat sweated through the band, watching me haul good-looking fruit to the pen. The sows came up to the fence at the sound of the basket. They do not care about Blossom and Rot. They took those tomatoes the way children take candy, and the juice ran pink down the boards, and I stood there a second longer than I needed to, because I could not make myself turn around and look at the man while I did it. "That's a shame," Alvin said. "It is." "You watering them?" "When the well lets me." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has already decided the trouble is not his. Alvin Teal farmed 240 acres of the good black bottom east of the road, and he had a gasoline pump on a skid and 100 rods of canvas hose, and he could put a creek onto a melon field in an afternoon. He told me the creek was down to a wet thread below the culvert, and he was having to dig a sump hole and let it fill and pump it in bursts. He told me he'd bring the pump up my way once he'd finished with the melons. He meant it kindly, and we both knew the melons would carry him into September, and by September my tomatoes would be a memory and a hog's opinion. Then his eyes went past me to the granary wall, where the jugs were stacked in the shade in 3 tiers, with straw between them, 39 of them, brown and unglazed and thick through the belly, every last one cracked at the neck or short a handle. "Still got your crockery, I see." "Still got it. Ella May says you paid $7 for that load." $7 and I hauled it myself. He laughed. It was not a mean laugh. It was the laugh of a man who does not want to hurt you and cannot quite hold it in, and he wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist to put it away. Then he started off toward the mailbox, and about 10 steps out he half turned and said, $7 would have bought you 100 foot of hose, and lifted a hand and went on up the road with the dust standing behind his boots and not settling because there was nothing in the air to bring it down. I did not answer him, and I have thought about that since. There was nothing to answer with. Since the 2nd of June we had had a 1/4 inch of rain, all of it on one Tuesday evening, enough to spot the dust and make the swallows happy and do nothing else. My well would give 4 gallons a minute for about 20 minutes and then commence to suck and cough and bring up sand, and I had learned to shut it off before it did, because a well that swallows its own sand is a well that quits. So I hauled in a barrel on the wagon from the stock tank and dipped and poured 5 plants to a bucket, and I could see with my own eyes what I was doing to them. The water ran off the crust and found a crack and went straight down past everything, or it stood in the little basin I had scratched around the stem and was gone in an hour to the sun and the air. Feast, then famine, then feast. 8 days of dry and then a gulp. That is how you make a black scar on the bottom of every good tomato in a field, and I was making them by the bushel. The last week of July, I got down on my knees with a trowel between 2 Rutgers plants and dug to see what I had underneath. 3 inches of damp, no more, and it smelled like a wet rag. Under that, powder. The roots were not going down into anything. They were running out sideways just below the crust, like a man feeling along a dark wall for a door, hunting that thin skin of moisture I was giving them every 8th day. I sat back on my heels with the trowel across my knee and looked at the jugs stacked against the granary in the shade and thought about how a man at a farm sale had told me the truth about them, and I had not listened to the half of it that mattered. He had said they were seconds. Under-fired, he said. Never glazed, never taken up to heat, thrown for pickling and sorghum, and turned down at the pottery door because they would not hold. That was the word he used. Wouldn't hold. And the auctioneer had said the same thing in his sing-song when nobody would bid on the hayrack load, said it like a joke on whoever raised a hand. I carried one of the sound-looking ones down to the horse trough that evening to see for myself. I dipped it full and set it on the flat stone at the end of the trough where the light came in low and yellow, and I stood there with my hands on my hips like a fool watching a jug. The crack at the neck let go a bead of water and stopped. But the belly went dark. All the way around, up from the base and out toward the shoulder, the brown of that clay turned the color of coffee grounds, and then it beaded, hundreds of little beads standing out on it like sweat on a man's forearm, and when I put my palm against the side and took it away, my hand was cool and my palm was wet. A drop gathered under the curve and hung and fell on the stone, and then another, slow, maybe the way an old faucet weeps in a cellar. I put a mark on the inside of the neck with a nail where the water stood, and I came back at first dark, and it had gone down a little better than an inch in 3 hours, out through the clay itself, in every direction at once, into the air where it did no good on earth. Into the air, not into ground. I dug a hole that same night by lantern at the head of the north row, deep enough that only the cracked neck stood above the dirt, and I set a jug in it and packed the soil in tight around the belly with my knuckles, and I filled it with 3 gallons from the barrel and laid a piece of slate over the mouth to keep the light and the mosquitoes out. Then I drove a lath in beside the nearest plant and tied a strip of white rag on it so I would not lose which one it was, and I wrote the date in the tally book. By morning, the ground over that jug had not crusted. I could smell wet clay when I knelt down, that cellar smell, and there was a dark ring in the dust, the size of a dinner plate, that the sun had not taken yet. And I got to thinking about the corn crib those jugs came out of, 39 of them, set mouth down in 2 rows on a bed of dry straw, out of the weather, out of the frost. 4 of them wrapped in feed sacks and tied with twine. Nobody stores worthless crockery like that. Nobody wraps a thing that wouldn't hold. So that evening, after the milking and after the supper dishes, I carried the lamp out to the shed and cut the twine on the 4 wrapped ones. I saved the twine, wound it around a nail on the post the way my mother wound hers, because you do not throw away 4 good lengths of binder twine in a dry year, and because I wanted a moment before I looked. The feed sacks came apart in my hands like old newsprint. The printing on them faded to a ghost of a mill name I did not know, and inside the sacks was chaff, oat hulls, dusty and sweet-smelling, packed all around and stuffed down into the necks. Somebody had put those jugs to bed. The first one out was not like the others. It was paler, the color of a cracked walnut shell, and there was no glaze on it anywhere, not on the shoulder, not around the lip, not a drip or a run of brown the way the barn jugs all had. It was thin. I could feel it in my wrists when I lifted it, the way you can feel that one egg in the basket is lighter than the rest. And it was cool. 91 degrees in that shed at 8 in the evening, the tin still ticking as it let the day go, and that jug against my forearm was cool as a stone out of the creek. On top of it, packed in the chaff, was a lid, a shallow clay saucer with a little knob in the middle, unglazed like the jug, fitted to the mouth so close it turned with a sound like a lid on a butter crock. There was one for each of the 4. I turned the first jug over, scratched into the bottom, before the firing, with something no wider than a nail point, was a set of initials I could not make out clean and the number 12. I set it on the workbench, spread out a page of the county paper, and stood the jug on the paper. Then I went to the pump and filled it. 2 gallons and a little, the pump handle groaning, the water coming up warm from the pipe and going cold as it ran. I put the lid on. I went in and rubbed liniment into my shoulder and read 4 pages of a seed catalog I had read in February, and when I came back out with the lamp, the newsprint under that jug was dark all the way out to the edges of the paper, and my finger came off the belly of it wet. There it was, the flaw, the thing the whole county had laughed at, because a hug that sweats is a joke in a hardware store. It will not hold your vinegar, it will not hold your cider, it will not hold sweet milk down a well on a rope, and it will not hold kerosene worth a nickel. When Dale came out that first week and thumped one with his knuckle and heard it go dull instead of ringing, he said I had bought 39 leeks and hauled them 9 miles uphill, and the men at the elevator got 2 months out of that. Orville Petrie asked me every single Saturday, gentle as church, whether my crockery was holding up. I always told him it was holding about as well as ever, and he always laughed, and I never once had to lie. 2 days after that, I drove over to Alma Reineke's with a pail of green beans she did not need, because Alma was 81 and had lived on that road her whole life and had a memory like a nail in a beam. She was on the porch, snapping beans into a dishpan, the shells going into her apron, and she did not look up while I told her about the corn crib and the 2 rows set mouth down on the straw. When I got to the part about the pale ones with the lids, she quit snapping. Sharon Creek, she said. I waited. Tile works down on Sharon Creek. My father hauled clay for them with a mule when I was small. They made drain tile mostly, and flue liner, and jugs and crocks for the trade. She went back to the beans. The ones that came out of the low end of the kiln never got hot enough, underfired, wouldn't take glaze right and wouldn't hold a thing. They called them weepers, sold them 3 for a dime out behind the shed, and half of them went in the ravine. She bought them, I said, by the wagon load. Alma smiled at her dishpan. Twice a year, spring and fall, and the men down there thought she was simple. She'd buy the culls, she'd knock on them and pick out the ones that sounded worst. She snapped one more bean and set the pan aside. I'll tell you something, she never lost a garden. Not in 34, not in 36, not the year the creek quit and the Hoyle boys hauled water for their stock out of the gravel pit. She had tomatoes in August of 36. She brought my mother a lard bucket of them, and my mother cried. I sat on the top step with my hands on my knees and listened to a locust winding up out in the elms, and out past Alma's yard, the corn in her son's field was curling its leaves in that middle-of-the-day way that has nothing to do with heat and everything to do with thirst, gray-green and rolling shut like fingers. How did she do it? I asked. Set them in the ground to the neck, Alma said. Filled them Sunday and Wednesday and put the lids on so the mosquitoes and the dirt stayed out. Plants set right up against the shoulder of the jug. She thought about it. There was more to it than that. Spacing, and how deep, and which ones for which crop. She had it all wrote down somewhere. She wrote everything down. She kept a tally on her cellar wall of what she canned back to 1912. I drove home the long way, past my own field, and I made myself look at it the way a stranger would. Corn knee-high in June and paling, the creek down to 3 pools with the bones of last year's leaves cooking in them. Su hijo tenía que haberse ido con su madre el día antes, pero esta no se había presentado a recogerle. That night I went back into the crib with the lantern and got down on my knees and counted the dark rings on the straw where the jugs had stood, and there were 48 of them. I had 39 jugs. The tile works on Sharon Creek had been cold since before the war, and I did not know yet whether 9 jugs had been broke or sold, or were still out there in the ground somewhere, holding water for a woman who had been dead 2 years. I blew out the lantern before I climbed down out of that barn, and then I sat on the running board of the truck in the dark a while doing arithmetic that would not come out even. 39 jugs standing in rows in my own shed at home, some of them with hairline cracks you could follow with a fingernail from shoulder to base. 48 rings on the barn floor, dark as coffee stains, printed into the chaff where something round and heavy had stood long enough to keep the dust off the boards beneath it. 9 of them empty, 9 circles with nothing in the middle but straw. The place was 2 years quiet by then. The house had a paper sticker on the door from the county and a wren nesting in the porch light, and the windmill turned when the wind came without sending up so much as a spoonful, because the pump rod had been pulled and stood against the tank like a fishing pole somebody meant to come back for. There was a pear tree by the smokehouse loaded with hard little pears no one would eat. I remember thinking that a farm does not go wild all at once. It goes wild in order. First the fence rows, then the yard, then the garden, then the roof, and this one had gotten about as far as the yard. Driving home, I made the honest list of what could have become of 9 jugs. Broke in the hauling, sold off before the sale ever got advertised, set out on a stump for boys to throw rocks at, which is the end of half the crockery in this county, somebody's flower stand, somebody's chicken waterer. That was the sensible list, and I have never been able to leave a sensible list alone. So the next morning, after I had milked and set out one more flat of tomato plants into dust that puffed up around my wrists, I drove over to the man who had taken my $7. He was greasing a mower in his lot, and he did not stand up all the way when he talked to me, which is its own kind of answer. I asked him if he recollected how many jugs he had hauled out of that barn. 40, he said. 40 or right at it. Then he wiped his hands on the seat of his pants and said the thing I have thought about every dry summer since. Nobody counts cracked jugs. I asked whether there had been any others about the place, out in the weeds maybe, and he said he had not gone looking, and that if I wanted the weeds too, I could have them for another $1. He laughed at his own joke, and I laughed with him, because he was not being unkind, only ordinary. Then he shook his head at the mower and said, half to himself, she'd have told you they wasn't cracked. She'd say they was breathing. I asked him what he meant by that. He said he did not know what she meant by it. He said she had told him that when he was 12 years old and hauling her feed, and he had thought then that she was the kind of old woman who talked to her stove. That was on a Tuesday. It did not rain that Tuesday, nor any day that week, and the men at the elevator had started saying the word drought and then taking it back, the way you take back a card you have laid down wrong. It was dry enough that June that the corn leaves rolled by 2 in the afternoon and unrolled at dusk, and the creeks were showing the gravel bars we usually only see in August. Nothing at all, compared to what came the next year. But it was in me by then, the itch of a number that would not close, and Thursday evening after chores, I put a spade and a lantern in the truck and went back. I found it because it was green. The garden square behind that house was 40 foot by 60, laid out along the south side of the smokehouse with a lilac at one corner, and 2 years of neglect had turned it the same rusty brown as the ditches, foxtail gone to seed and dying, pigweed with red stems and papery leaves, all of it standing there cured on the stalk like hay nobody cut. All of it but one rectangle out in the middle, maybe 10 foot by 15, where the burdock stood knee-high and thick and shining, and the lamb's quarter was so juicy and dark you could have cooked a mess of it for supper. Weeds, only weeds, but weeds with water under them in a June that did not have water in it anywhere else on that hill. I walked into the middle of that green patch and my boot turned on a stone. They were creek stones, flat as griddle lids, and once I had found the first one, I found the others without hunting, because they were set in a pattern, and the mind picks up a pattern quicker than it picks up a thing. 3 rows of 3. 7 of my boot lengths between one and the next, near enough the same every time, and the rows running north and south so a man walking a hoe down them would not have to break stride. 9 stones. I stood there in the smell of hot weeds with my hands hanging down and said the number out loud like a fool, and something in my chest settled into place the way a wagon settles when the load finally sits right. I pried up the middle stone with the spade and then got down on my knees in the stubble and finished with my hands, because the spade had already told me there was something hollow under there and I did not want to be the one who broke it. The top 3 inches came away like ash. Under that the clay went the color of a walnut shell and held together in plates, and at about 8 inches down my knuckles found cold, not shade cold, the kind of cold that comes off a crock in a cellar. I sat back on my heels in that August field, with the cicadas grinding away in the fence row, and put my palm flat against the dirt the way you'd put it on a child's forehead, and it was damp. Damp in the second summer of no rain, in ground that had cracked open wide enough elsewhere to swallow a hoe handle. I dug around what my knuckles had found instead of at it, the way you dig up a bulb you mean to keep. 10 minutes of that, and I had the shoulder of a jug bare to the light, mouth up, buried to the neck, so the rim would have sat maybe 2 inches under the plow line, low enough that a cultivator would never kiss it, and a man on foot with a hoe would step right over it without knowing. There was a flat gray stone laid over the mouth, worn smooth on one face, sized so exactly to the opening that I understood somebody had sat on a porch somewhere and tried a good many stones before settling on that one. I lifted it off. Inside was dark, and there was a spider in there living a life she had earned, and about 2 fingers of water standing in the bottom of a jug that had not been filled by human hands in longer than I had been alive. The clay was cracked. Of course it was cracked. Every jug in the load I'd hauled home for $7 had a crack in it somewhere, which is why the whole load went for $7, and why the auctioneer had said, "And God bless you, ma'am," when he took my money. This one had a crack running from the shoulder down toward the base like a lightning strike drawn by a child, and around that crack and around the whole belly of the jug from neck to bottom was a mat of roots. Not one root, hundreds. White gone brown, fine as sewing thread and thick as pencil lead, wrapped and rewrapped around that jug in a felt so dense I had to work my thumbnail under it to see the clay at all. They had grown to it. Some had grown into the crack itself and dried there like veins in marble. Whatever had been planted beside that jug had put out its roots in every direction it could, found the one cool wet thing in a hard field, and held on with both hands. I stayed down there a long while. The knees of my dungarees went dark from that damp ring in the ground, and I let them. Then I got up and pried the second stone, and the third, and by the time the sun was over on the barn roof, I had all 9 of them out, and 9 jugs standing bare-shouldered in the ground, in 3 rows of 3, spaced 4 good paces apart, mouths up, stone caps stacked beside them like plates off a table. 7 of the 9 still held water. 2 had broken clean through the bottom and had a mouse skeleton and a great deal of history in them. Every single one of them, even the broken ones, wore that same felt of old roots around the belly, and around every single one of them, the clay of my field was 2 shades darker than it had any right to be. I want to say I understood it all standing there. What I mostly did was walk to the well house, draw a bucket, walk back out, and fill the closest jug to the brim just to see what it would do. It sweated. That is the plainest word for it. Inside of 5 minutes, the outside of that jug went from dust gray to the color of a wet stone, and the shine crept up it slow and even, and when I laid my hand on the outside, my hand came away wet without a drop ever having run. The crack did not gush. It wept. Fired clay that nobody bothered to glaze, buried to the neck and filled with water, gives that water up to dry ground about as fast as dry ground wants it and not one bit faster, and it does not give 1 thimbleful to the sun. Tuesday evening I filled that jug and set the stone back on its mouth. Thursday morning the water was down 2 inches, and the ring of dark earth around it had spread out to about the width of a dinner plate. Saturday it was down 5, and the ring was the size of a wagon wheel, and there was a volunteer tomato growing up out of the fence-row trash 18 inches away that had been half dead on Tuesday and was standing up green on Saturday, like it had heard good news. Along about then, Delbert Rohn came up the lane in his truck to see about borrowing my chain, and he stopped and leaned out and watched me kneeling out there in a field with 9 holes in it and a stack of flat rocks beside me. "You burying them," he said, "or planting them?" I said I hadn't decided. He laughed and drove up to the barn and got his chain, and when he came back down he slowed again and hollered out that if I got thirsty I ought to try the crick. And then he remembered the crick was down to a wet string and there was no joke left in it, and he waved and went on. I did not hold it against him. He had 80 acres of corn out on the east side of the road that was rolling its leaves up like paper spills by 10 in the morning, and a man watching that happen is entitled to laugh at whatever is handy. What kept me awake that night was not the water. It was the 9th stone. 8 of those holes had a jug in them. The 9th, the one at the end of the middle row, closest to where the old orchard used to run, had no jug at all. It had the print of one, a smooth-sided socket in the hardpan with a ring pressed into the bottom exactly the size of a jug base, and the socket was dry and clean, and the flat gray capstone had been laid back over the empty mouth of it, careful as a lid on a jar. Somebody had lifted that one out on purpose. Somebody had covered the hole back up afterward, the way a person does when they mean to come back to it. I put the stone back and left it alone for 11 days, and if you want to know why, the answer is that I had 51 holes of my own to dig and a sky that had quit talking to me. Before I dug a single one of them, though, I went back out to those 8 in the gray light of morning with a folding rule and a stub of pencil, and I wrote down everything the ground would tell me. The jugs sat 4.5 feet apart, 2 rows of 4, with the rows 5 feet from each other, so that each one stood at the corner of a square, and the squares overlapped the way tiles do. Every jug was buried to the neck, with the mouth standing a hand's width above the hardpan and the shoulder well under it, and every one of them was cracked. That is the part I had walked past twice without seeing. 6 of the 8 had a split running down from the lip. One had a chip out of the rim big enough to lay 2 fingers in, and every crack had been turned to sit above a faint dark ring on the inside of the clay, a stain like the tide line in a rain barrel, about 2/3 of the way up. She had never filled them past that ring. Whatever was broken on those jugs was broken above the water, where a crack cannot leak because there is nothing there to leak. $7, the men at the sale had said, for a wagon load of flower pots with the bottoms out. What I had actually bought was 70-some vessels whose only fault sat in the part that was never meant to hold anything. So I moved the ones I had already set. 22 of them were in wrong, too shallow, most, standing up out of the dirt like fence posts where the sun could get at them, and 3 of them sunk so deep the mouths were under the surface and would have taken silt with every filling. I pulled them, one at a time, on my knees, working the spade around them in a circle until the ground let go, and I reset every one to the neck. It took me 4 days. The dirt in that ground was the color of a brick and had a smell to it when you opened it up, cool and mineral, like the inside of a cellar. My hands cracked at the knuckles, and I taped them and kept on. By the last week of May, I had 51 jugs in the ground, 32 through the melon patch, 12 down the tomato rows, and 7 among the peppers and the little stand of squash by the yard fence, each one capped with a flat rock off the creek bank, because she had capped hers, and I had learned by then to do what she had done before I asked why. The rain quit on the 10th of May, half an inch that evening, enough to lay the dust and swell the barrel, and after that, the sky went white at the edges and stayed that way. There was a wind out of the southwest most days that put a fine grit on the leaves and dried the sweat on you before it ran. The creek went from a run to a chain of pools with green skins on them. The county road turned to powder, and every truck on it dragged a tail of dust 300 yards long, and you could stand in my yard and tell who was going to town by the color of the cloud. June was hot and cloudless, and July had no mercy in it at all. The corn across the section line began rolling its leaves by 10 in the morning, the way corn does, folding up into tight gray-green spears to save itself, and by the middle of July it had quit pretending. The man who farmed that quarter ran a pump off the creek until the creek would not give him anything but mud, then hauled water in a fuel tank he had steamed out, 1 tank load per pass, spraying it out over the top of the ground where the wind took most of it before it ever got dark. I would hear his tractor going at 4 in the afternoon, and I would watch that spray come apart in the air, silver and pretty and gone. I hauled mine at first light, 1 barrel on a stone boat behind the mule, a 2-gallon bucket, a funnel of rolled tin, 2 gallons to a jug, filled to the ring and no higher. 51 jugs came to 102 gallons, and with what I slopped and what I drank, it ran nearer 110, and I did that every 4th day in June and every 3rd day in August. An hour and 50 minutes, walking, with the mule stopping when I stopped, which he learned in a week and never forgot. The first time I dug down beside a jug to see what was happening, I did it in the evening with a trowel, gentle, expecting to be disappointed. 2 inches down the ground was dust, and it went on being dust for another 2. Then it turned. The color changed to a dark, even brown, and stayed dark all the way out to 8 inches from the clay, a moist collar spreading down and sideways under a field that looked from horseback like a plate somebody had dropped. And laid flat against the side of the jug, matted there like the felt in a hat, was a mass of white root hair, so thick I could not tell one plant's from another's. Those vines had found the seep and had quit wandering. They had moved in. That was when I understood what I had been given, and it was not water, because anybody can carry water. It was the arithmetic. He was throttling the water down until it moved slower than the heat could steal it, and he was putting every drop of it where the roots were, under a lid of dirt the sun never touched. That was the whole of it. A jug like that holds 2.5 gallons if you fill it to the neck, and buried to its shoulders with a flat stone over the mouth, it will give that 2.5 gallons up over 4 days, 5, sometimes better, weeping it out through the clay a bead at a time, and the plant standing over it takes nearly all of what leaves. I had spent the first summer pouring water on top of the ground out of a bucket and telling myself I was farming. I had watched a gallon go down at the base of a melon hill, and I had come back at dusk and pushed my thumb through a gray crust into dust. Half of that gallon went up into the air before the sun was over the barn roof. The other half ran sideways to nothing. Under the jug, the dirt was dark a hand's width out in every direction, and cool enough to make my wrist ache. So I quit thinking about rain, which is a thing a person cannot buy, and started thinking about arithmetic, which is free. That evening, I hauled the whole load out onto the barn floor and sorted it by lamplight, the way you'd sort seed potatoes. There were the ones that rang when I thumped them, sound as a church bell, with nothing wrong but a chip out of the lip. There were the ones with hairline cracks running down from the shoulder like the veins in a leaf, and those were the weepers, the ones I had thought were ruined. And there were the poor things with a piece gone out of the belly, which would not hold water any more than a hat holds smoke, and I set those aside without knowing yet what I'd do with them. Then I did what nobody had thought to do at that sale, which was test them. I cut the bottom out of a coffee can for a funnel and filled every jug on that floor, 2 quarts at a time, counting out loud, and I marked each one with a lump of chalk and wrote the numbers on the back of a feed store calendar with a pencil stub I kept behind my ear, until my hair went gray with the graphite. Then I waited. Some jugs were dry in 3 days, some took 6. One little squat one with a bottom like a hen's breast held its water 11 days and gave it up so slow I had to lay my palm on it to be sure it was working at all. That was when the crops sorted themselves out for me. The fast weepers went to the melons and the squash, which drink like a horse and don't care about manners. The middlers went to the tomatoes. The slow ones went to the peppers and to the 6 apple whips I'd stuck in the ground the spring before and had all but given up on. Every one of those jugs went in on its own, dug with a post-hole spade, its mouth an inch above grade with a lid of some kind on top, a cracked saucer, a shard from the ruined ones, a flat creek rock, a scrap of cedar shingle weighted with a brick. Mosquitoes will breed in an open jug and you will lose your water to the air besides, and I learned both those things the hard way in the same week. I buried 61 jugs that June. I know the number because I wrote it down, and because for a while I couldn't sit in a chair at night without feeling the spade handle in the heels of my hands. Delbert Roach came along the fence line the second week of it, on his way to look at his creek, which by then was a road of white stones with a wet stripe up the middle. He stood there with his hat in his hand and watched me set a jug and tamp it and lay a shingle over the mouth. "That's an awful lot of digging for a squash," he said. "It is," I said. He laughed the way a man laughs when he means no harm and no help either, and he said the Lord would send rain or he wouldn't, and either way it wasn't coming out of a broken crock. Up at the elevator that same month, they had me down as the woman who was planting pottery. Somebody drew a picture of a jug with leaves coming out of the neck and pinned it to the corkboard by the scale house, and I will say it was a good drawing. By the 4th of July, you could stand at my gate and read where every jug was. The field went gray-green with drought, and over each buried jug there was a ring of dark green about the size of a wagon wheel, deep and glossy, like coins dropped in dust. 61 dark rings in a pale field. Delbert's sprinkler ran a rainbow over his beans twice a week and made a crust you could skate on, and his beans stood there the color of a paper sack. Now here is the part that kept me awake, and it still does some nights. I was scrubbing a jug bottom with a wire brush, getting the old dirt off before I set it, and the brush turned up marks in the clay, scratched in with a nail while the clay was still soft, before ever it went in the fire. A number, a 4. I turned the next one over and found a 6. The little squat one that held its water 11 days had an 11 on the bottom of it, plain as a price tag. He had already tested them, every last one. Years before I ever handed over my $7, some old man had filled these jugs and sat on a bucket and counted the days and scratched the answer into the clay where nobody but a person on her knees would ever look for it. But it was not only numbers. On 9 of them, under the numeral, there was a letter and a second number in that same nail-scratched hand, W4, W4, N2, and on the last one I turned over, W11, with the numeral circled twice. I sat back on my heels in the barn dirt with that jug in my lap and understood, slow, the way you understand a thing you would rather not. Those weren't days. Those were places, and whatever ground he'd meant by W, it wasn't mine, and it hadn't been his for a long while either. I sat with that for a long while, until the light through the barn boards went the color of weak tea, and the swallows started their evening business overhead. The west ground had gone at the courthouse steps in a year I was too small to remember. The man who farmed it now ran better than 400 acres and a banknote to match, and he had been standing in the front row at the sale the day the auctioneer held up a rack of chipped stoneware and said $7, sold, to the girl in the back, and somebody behind me said, loud enough to carry, hope she likes crockery. So the old man had worked out his arithmetic on ground that no longer belonged to him. He had walked over there with a bucket and a nail and a notion, on land somebody else was paying taxes on, and he had knelt in rows he did not own and counted the days a plant could live off a buried jug. A man can lose the field and keep the answer. I did not know how to hold that at first. I know how now. I carried all of them out into the yard that week and laid them in rows on the grass the way he had laid them in dirt, W with W and N with N, and once they were in company I saw the thing I had been looking straight past for 2 months. Every jug had a line on it, a faint band around the shoulder or up under the throat, where the clay had been stained darker by the years it spent in the ground and the years it spent above it. The shallow set ones, the ones buried only to their shoulders, carried the small numbers. 4 days. 5. The one marked W11, with the numeral circled twice, had its stain line clean up under the lip, so that the only thing that ever showed above the dirt was a mouth the size of a coffee cup and whatever flat rock he had set over it. 11 days. A gallon and a half of creek water, a jug set deep with a stone cap, 4 hills of anything drinking off it, and 11 days in July before it needed filling again. That winter I dug. The ground took a mattock better than it took a spade, and I set the jugs at the spacings he had proved, and capped each one with a piece of slate off the fallen spring house. A tight jug holds water like a jar and gives you nothing. A cracked one weeps it out slow through the belly, into the dirt, down where roots are, and never once loses a drop to the sun. All that spring I filled them from the hole he had dug and covered, which I had opened and cribbed with cedar and covered again, and which gave me between 80 and 90 gallons a day if I did not get greedy with it. 141 jugs. I remember because I counted them twice and then a third time. The rain quit on the 9th of May. From the 1st of June to the middle of September, we got 1 inch and a tenth, all of it in showers that dried off the leaves before they wet the dirt. The creek went down to a chain of green pools with minnows crowded in them. The men who had laughed ran pipe and pumped, and by the 4th of July the pumps were sucking mud and coughing, and they hauled in stock tanks behind trucks and poured it out on top of the ground, and the sun took most of it back before dark. Corn fired brown from the bottom up. Corn fired brown from the bottom up, and the tassels came out dry as broom straw, and by August a man could walk a 40 and hear it rattle like a shut door. My ground held. 94 jugs, buried to their necks, took 11 gallons apiece a week from the creek pools by yoke and bucket, and gave it back a spoonful at a time down where the roots were, below the reach of the sun. I picked 460 pounds of tomatoes off 80 plants. The melons made, the squash made, the pole beans made twice. I put up 91 quarts and sold the rest off the tailgate on the Millerton Road for what people were glad to pay that year. Harlan Voss came the last week of September, hat in his hands, and stood a while looking at the green. "Where'd you get them jugs?" "Same place you did," I said. "You just drove on past." I told him about the clay bank below the old kiln, and I gave him 9 of mine to start, and Del Krieger 11, and I showed them how deep to set the neck. That winter I kept 1 cracked jug on the porch rail with a candle in it, and in the dark you could see the light come through the crack, thin as a thread, steady all night.